Ninja series. I am super excited to be here with you all and to talk through internationalization. Yet, I could have come up with maybe a talk about this and, share some of my experiences. It would have been, I think, decent, but the talk you're going to hear today is excellent, like super, super good. And I am really, really excited to bring on our guest here. Oh man, something is happening with my other screen here. And my computer actually is having a bit of a performance issue today. But I am super excited to bring on Navarr Barnier, who works with us. He's a coworker of mine, a absolute brilliant developer. I tell you what, we brought him on 6 months ago, and we quickly called him our code czar, and it's our code review czar. He's literally changed our code reviews, and I could not be more grateful for what he has done. He's challenged me on so many different levels, and I know that challenge is gonna continue today as he talks about internationalization. Real quick background, in case you don't know about him, he's a Magento programmer, developer. He's really, really, really sharp on that stuff. In very good with standards and all that stuff, which explains why he is part of the. He's also part of the PHP Fig group, framework interop group, and he also is, get this, he is an editor for the draft internationalization standard that's as part of the his duties on the framework interop group, which means he does know a thing or two about internationalization. And he's also part of the open source task force. So he's been a really good, solid part of those conversations, and I'm really excited to have him as part of the team. Real quick things. Philip Jackson, he's been a big part of the community for a long time. He's always said, you always want to surround yourself by people smarter than you yourself. And part of growing in a business, it's been a challenge. Like, I felt like there was a long period of time that I was the smartest person in the room, and I hated it. Like, I don't like that feeling. And it's crazy. In the past year plus, like, the ratio of of what I know and what I can do has fallen through the floor because of people like Navarr. I couldn't say enough good things. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it all over to Navarr. He's going to talk about internationalization, and be prepared to have your mind blown by one of the best in the industry.
Thank you, Joseph. I'm really surprised that it's been 6 months already. Time just really flies when you're enjoying it, you know?
That's good. Well, I've certainly been enjoying it. That's for sure. And you've definitely raked a couple of my code reviews over the coals in a nice way. You're incredibly polite about it, even though I'm guessing a couple of your thoughts in your mind are slightly different.
No, never. It's all about making sure that everyone is the best programmer they can be, right?
That's right. And you exemplified it. You have absolutely done all that, and I consider myself a very blessed person to be able to work with you every day.
Thank you. Likewise, definitely likewise.
All right. Well, that's good. It makes me feel good. So, what do you have to say about internationalization today?
So much. I'm actually really excited to get these slides in front of everyone and to talk about internationalization, because it's really something that I see a lot of developers sort of missing out on. There's a lot of ways in which we can really improve our programming to make internationalization just much, much better all around. So I'm going to be discussing, some background to internationalization, sort of what it is, and approaches that everyone can take to ensure their applications are localizable. The slides I'm going to show as part of this are focused on Magento, but they are applicable to the wider ecosystem, both inside and outside of PHP. So with that note, we're going to go ahead and get started. What is internationalization? If you're familiar with the term at all, you're probably familiar with a lot of other related terms like localization, globalization, translation, and then there are various shorthands like L10N and I18N. But in the context of this training, internationalization is the concepts and tools required to ensure quality usability of your Magento application with customers and even admin users all over the world. And we're going to start with some fun facts about internationalization. There are a lot of languages. There are so many languages. There are over 7,000 languages spoken today, which linguists believe makes up 142 language families. If that wasn't enough, researchers believe that there are at least, if not more, 4 written language parents. And what that means is that separately throughout the world, 4 different times, humans came up with the idea of writing their language down, and they did it in entirely different ways. You're likely familiar with the Latin alphabet. Maybe some people here are familiar with Cyrillic, with Arabic, and even runic alphabets maybe. And all of those are descendants of one language family, which is Egyptian hieroglyphics. It was influenced a little bit from cuneiform, which is another one of those 2 origins of written language, but primarily linguists believe it to be descended from Egyptian hieroglyphics. But that's really just sort of, Europe, the Middle East, starting to move into Asia. But far east of Europe, there's the Chinese family tree. China invented writing all on their own, and they did it in an entirely different way with symbols that have pronunciations. They're not really hieroglyphics, but they have meanings in them. And from the Chinese written language family tree, you get Japanese, Korean, and other Asian languages. The 4th is the Mesoamerican written languages. The only one that's even close to widely documented at this point is the Mayan written language, but there's not a ton of research there yet, just because a lot of documents and stuff went missing during the colonization period, which is unfortunate, but there's still a lot to find out there. So moving on, with all those different languages, with those different forms of writing languages that all developed independently, there's a bunch of complications that differ between languages. The most obvious to everyone is probably, well, maybe not pluralized, gender-based conjugation is probably the most obvious to everyone. Anyone who has had any sort of, contact with both English and Romance languages knows that in, say, Spanish, I think verbs, definitely adjectives, can be conjugated based on the gender of what they're describing. So that's a huge complication for written language and spoken language, but also pluralization. In English, you have basically 2 forms. You have the one item, where you just use singular form, and you have 0 in everything else, which is a plural form. But other languages, like I believe Ukrainian is one of them, has more forms of pluralization. In coding, we call it a few form, where they just change the conjugation of, I think, their verbs based on how much there is. Similar to pluralization, some languages have counter words. This is pretty much, what's the word I'm looking for? You don't find it in English, like, ever. If I had to give an English example of like a counter word, it would be like bales of hay, right? So if you're talking about hay, you might say, I have 3 bales. Bales there would be a counter. And these are prevalent in languages like Chinese and Japanese, where for the noun, there is a specific counter that declares what type of object it is, like round objects or flat objects that you have to use in addition to that number. But there's still more. There's date formatting. Date formatting is widely different between various languages. There's currency formatting, and number formatting. So decimals can be different symbols. The commas that you'd use in English numbers might be decimals, or might be periods in like German, or they might be in different places on the number. You have multi-byte encodings now. So if you use, say, the PHP string methods, you're familiar with using, say, 1 byte per letter, but there can be upwards of 4 bytes per character in the set, and then there can be multiple characters per one character on screen. Um, and then, of course, directionality. Um, a lot of European languages are left to right, top to bottom, but there are languages like Hebrew and Arabic, which are right to left, top to bottom, and then languages like Chinese and Japanese, which in certain texts are top to bottom and then right to left. And we'll show examples of all that throughout these slides. One of the primary purposes of this is, in addition to showing you sort of what actions you can take to make sure that your applications work with these language complications, is to ensure that you're aware of them. Because one of the primary problems, of course, is that programmers aren't super aware of how broadly varied language can be in the world. And just raising that awareness makes sure that you write better applications to take it into account when it comes time for localization and translation and globalization. So one of the primary approaches to these, especially in Magento, is just when you're writing your messages, you want to stick to a single message, which can be difficult with plurals, I'm sure some of you know. But I will be showing you a syntax called message format, which was introduced in Magento 2.3.4. Here on screen, you can see an incredibly complex example. If you already recognize what's happening, you're way ahead of the crowd. But this is message format. It's a special language that would be used just like any other message that you send through the Magento translator using the double underscore here, or by constructing a phrase object. And this special language is incredibly useful to translators, and it'll be useful to you as well, even in your base language. And I'll show some clear examples once we get into the individual complications. So we'll jump straight into plurals. Plurals are a very common issue. They're in, I think, every language. But you can see over here on the left side what I consider bad examples. At the very bottom there are number orders with the S being in parentheses. And the reason that's a bad example is because it's a bad experience for the user, right? It looks unprofessional, like there wasn't a lot of work put into it. The one benefit it has is that it's still a single string for when it gets to the translator. Above that, though, you have a far worse scenario, which is you have a message that changes based on an external variable. And you can see there for 0, there are no orders. 1, there is 1 order. Default, there are %1 orders. And in all of those situations, you're forcing the translators to write 3 different translation messages and understand the context there. And that's not great for anyone, right? That makes everyone's job just a little bit harder. There's just better ways. So if we go over to the right-hand side, you can see a version in message formatter where you have the one message, you open up, you use this brace, which is the message format special syntax. You put in your variable name, orders. You tell it that you're using the plural syntax here. So it's going to select one of these based on that variable. There are some keywords. So the keywords are 0, like the word 0, 1, 2, few, many, and other, which is a catch-all. And then you can do equals and then a specific number when necessary. So here we have when orders is equal to 0, there are no orders. And it'll read out like there are no orders. When it's 1, there's, I have R here, but I really should take R out of there and put it here. Are no orders, is 1 order, are number orders. So my mistake, but easily fixed. And then other is the catch-all for just whatever it is. And that's, important to English. As we see in chat, Łukasz gave an example in Polish, I believe. So showing, I think, few. And then here in Japanese, we just show a Japanese version where the verb is actually changing from orders don't exist to an amount of orders exists. But you can see that it is 2 cases, and in English it's 3 cases, but it's the same message. The translator only has one message to deal with, and done. Our next complication is gendered conjugations. I don't have any examples of that readily available to me. I'm not super familiar with the Romance languages. But if you are, I'm sure you can think of one. But in English, we have pronouns, and pronouns are in a lot of other languages as well, gendered pronouns. So here we have an example using gendered pronouns, where a person is responding that that person liked a post, and that's the message. So here we supply the variables, the gender of the person, and we supply their name. And then we create what is essentially a select statement. So name responded that, special syntax, variable to look for, gender. We're doing a selection here. And if gender is equal to male, we put a he. If it's equal to female, a she. If it's anything else, we put a they. So name responded that maybe they liked your post. Very simple. Like plurals, the underlying framework, which is message format, was introduced in Magento 2.3.4. That's one of the important takeaways from this, but hopefully everyone is on 2.3.4 or above at this point in time. So a good note here is that what select is essentially a switch statement, right? It's really important that you only use this for what I'm going to call linguistic logic. You shouldn't be using this for business logic, because that'll make a translator's job more difficult. When it comes to business logic, where the context changes, you should definitely still use your if statements, your select statements. But when it comes to just logic within the phrase itself, where certain variables change and it's still the same meaning, you can use a select statement. Our next complication is less a complication and more something that I just see people get wrong a lot, which is doing emphasis and writing HTML in conjunction with sort of your messages. Our bad example is something that I have seen way more than I wish I had ever seen, which is where you're assembling a string, maybe you have a link in it, and you translate each part separately. So you have the please view and then link, and then your order and then end link. And to the translator, those show up as the messages please view and the message your order. You lose context there. It makes it difficult for them to move the link around if they need to, based on the words that they're translating. And it certainly makes the messages more disconnected. And that's the big problem there. On the right, though, is the way you should be approaching it, which is you put those links in line. Please view, link tag, URL, link attributes, your order. And then with our escape HTML, because you should always be escaping messages that come through translation since you don't know what's in them, we tell it to expect A tags. That's one approach here. Another approach is that you could put in placeholders for the entire link that are like start link and end link, and either send those through as variables or replace them after it's been translated. And those are both much better ways to do it as opposed to this. Moving on from that, we have the very fun date and time formats. Date and time is a complication that I discussed earlier, but it's super easy in message format as well. You can put in your variable, you specify a date, you specify date or time depending on what you're trying to output. and then you specify the format type, which is, there's one called default, and I'm not sure what that shows, but I think it's Joseph is right. You should be using escaper in 2.4. But there's default, there's long, there's full, which will show the day of the week as well in English and Japanese for sure. There's medium and there's short. And I assume short would be something like 4/5/2022, that sort of thing. So I have some examples on screen. English, I wrote these yesterday. English is April 5th, 2022. I meant to put in today's date, messed it up. Japanese, you have the year symbol, the month symbol, the day symbol. And then this is Iranian Farsi, which is probably way out of left field, but I wanted a really good example of what's going on here, which is that this does not say April 5th, 2022, because Iran does not use a Gregorian calendar. And that's the real complication here. Iran uses a calendar called the solar Hijri calendar. And so message format here is smart enough to convert the Gregorian date to the Hijri date. And that says that it's the 16th day of the month Farvarden in the year 1401. So that's really probably unexpected for a lot of people, is that there are 4 countries in the world, at least, that don't use the Gregorian calendar. So when you're writing dates, that's really something to keep in mind. Those 4 countries are Iran, Afghanistan, Nepal, and Ethiopia. So I think that's maybe pleasant's the wrong word, but a surprise for sure. Multibyte encoding is another one of those complications. And I show, an example of how it's easy to get it wrong here on screen. I put together a simple string here, which is, the letter E plus a Unicode combining acute accent. It's 2 Unicode characters, but it shows up as 1. So if you run string length on it, it shows up as 3 bytes. If you run multi-byte string length on it, it shows up as 2 bytes. But PHP has a nice function called grapheme for some string functions, like string length for finding strings, for truncating strings. And it shows that it is 1 character when shown on the screen. The reason I bring this up is because maybe not commonly, but commonly enough that it's something you'd think about, you probably use a substring function. And if you use anything other than grapheme's substring without knowing sort of the contents of it, you can be cutting off accents, you can be pulling emoji in half, and that sort of thing. Emoji is really one of the big complications with multi-byte encoding as well, because most of the emoji are in what, if I remember correctly, is called the astral plane of Unicode, and that is not a joke, the astral plane. And they are 4 bytes apiece. And where this gets interesting is that MySQL, and especially I think the character set that Magento defaults to for MySQL, only supports up to 3 bytes per character. So one of your potential gotchas is that when you're creating tables, you need to be using the proper MySQL encoding if you're bringing in customer input, like comments. And that encoding would be, I don't have this on screen, but UTF-8 MB4 _ 0900 _ AI _ CI. The MB4 tells MySQL that allow up to 4 bytes per character. 0900 references the Unicode spec. AI says that it's accent insensitive for sorting and searching. CI says that it's case insensitive for sorting and searching. So those are your big gotchas, especially when it comes to foreign languages, when it comes to emoji, and it's a pretty important part for internationalization, I think. From multi-byte encoding, our next complication is directionality. And CSS has, especially in recent times, implemented some approaches here to help with this. So what the table that's showing on screen here is the writing mode property, where you have horizontal top to bottom, which is what English is typically written in, and Chinese and Japanese can be written in it. You have vertical left to right, which I'm unsure of any language that does it. You have vertical right to left, which is, one of the native Japanese and Chinese methods where they write right to left. And you can see here how the English characters end up sideways, but the Japanese characters and the Chinese characters don't, because that's a native writing method. And then you have sideways methods of writing, which unfortunately are not widely supported yet. It's definitely a good feature for when you need sideways text, especially so it can be written properly, but it's only supported in Firefox at this time. So to support these different sort of writing methods, the CSS introduced something called logical properties. And this might be new to a lot of people. It was certainly new to me, which is that instead of using margin left, margin top, padding left, padding top, you have block start, block end, inline start, and inline end. So your margin block start, your margin block end, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this is important for when text is changing direction. So if you have an application that supports left to right languages and right to left languages, and you're using margin right for, say, an inline image, and you have different margins on different sides, it might surprise you when it looks slightly wrong in the other language, because it's being read right to left, but suddenly your paddings are switched from the way it's being read. And that is how these margin inline start and margin inline end help with that. So for blocks are, in a typical English document format, blocks are up and down. If you do div display block, it has its own line, and then the next one on its own line. But say in a top to bottom, right to left language, the block start and block end could be on the right and left sides of the element, because it's being read top to bottom, and then a new line would essentially be move it over to the left a little bit. In the same way, inline is sort of where that block or this element is in regards to the text flow. So in English, left to right, but it can vary. In addition to that, this also works with border radius. When you're doing border radius, the order is still the same. You have border radius start, border radius start end, border radius end, and border radius end start, I think it is. In addition to your margin, your border, your padding, you also need to consider languages when you're aligning text just in general. Instead of text align left and right, you should use text align start and end. Center is luckily still center. And that pretty much sums up directionality. So there's one more neat feature in Magento that I wanted to show you. And this is a feature that I only learned about when I was taking the front-end test. It didn't come up at any other point in time, but it is that Magento supports using different assets for different locales as part of theme fallback. And the way that looks is that when you're falling back through your theme, you can specify a locale for the asset specifically. So a good example here would be that if you support English and Japanese, you want to use a different image for Japan. So you would specify, instead of just web image.png, you'd probably specify web i18n ja_jp image.png. And then when the website's being displayed in Japanese, it'll take the Japanese image instead of the English image. And the way fallback works with that is it checks the themes I18N folder, it moves on to the themes base folder, and then moves on to the modules I18N and modules base folder. A potential gotcha there would be if you're expecting it to fall from the themes I18N folder to the modules I18N folder. It will not do that. It'll go back and look at the theme before it looks at any module locale specific files. But that is all I have for you today. So I am happy to open the floor up to any questions.
That was, excuse me, that was really good, Navarr. There was a lot of things in there I had never known about, like I forget the term you used for it, but the internationalization strings in Magento, being able to add those queries. Was that the term in there?
Message formatter is the formatter, and they're just typical Magento phrases as the object that Magento uses for it.
Yeah, that was really awesome, and yeah, it was really good feedback about about what you mentioned about the block HTML and the escape HTML and all that stuff. So yeah, there was a lot that I did not know about, and I feel like I have a much better understanding of language and all that stuff. So that was really good. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Like I said, a lot of developers don't know how wildly varied language can be. So it's a unique pleasure of mine to sort of spread that information around.
Absolutely. And like I said at the beginning, you definitely have more of a handle on it in a significant way than I do. So I'm really grateful that I didn't have to try to figure out what to say for something conversation like this, and you had it. Yeah, as always, really good information. That's why I say, folks, those of you that are out there listening, it's a absolute pleasure working with Navarr, and I I don't think he's had a comment yet on internationalization, but it's well deserved if and when he does have one of those on my pull requests. So that's good. Yeah. All right. Well, like Navarr said, is there any questions on this? Get these blocks I have to do. Any questions on what Navarr has talked about? Some great feedback here. Yeah, Wukash. Yeah, good comment. Yep, definitely. Never ending story with. Put that up there. Asia date format's now a little bit easier. Yeah, absolutely. Excellent. Well, this is really good. And I think that we could wrap it up. Yep, absolutely. So I don't think there was any comments, Navarr, which means that you win the award for the most understandable presentation given yet. So
either that,
good for you
or
on
I've
that.
confused everyone with the massive amount of information available on this topic.
There was, well, I wouldn't say confused in the slightest, but I will say that there is a tremendous amount of information that you gave. It was a bit of a sip from the fire hose, and it was good. Like, again, I think it's easy for us developers to get into a mode of, well, for me, English, like, what other language is there? Well, no, actually, reality, I think English is common in the world, but it's by no means probably even the number one language in the world, I'm guessing. Certain Chinese, like, as far as people speaking it, might be the most. I'd be actually curious to know those numbers, and we have to be keeping that in mind. It is absolutely critical. I mean, maybe if a merchant is only in the United States, it's less of an issue, but sooner or later, it's probably going to become an issue. And if we haven't done proper internationalization, we're going to have a lot of redo work to come back through and try to clean the whole project back up, as opposed to just starting with it best practice from the very beginning.
Absolutely, yeah. And like I said,
Cool.
this is only the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more, especially with these message formats, which can be looked up on the PHP documentation website. Um, there's just it's a ton of information. So
Absolutely. This is good. This is good. Navarr, thank you. I appreciate you coming on and giving us these words of wisdom. And I hope for all of you that have been out there listening, participating in this, that you don't just say, oh, yeah, that was a great conversation. Thanks, Navarr. But instead that you actually take some time and use this as a launching your ability to launch into making this knowledge yourself. Again, it doesn't do any good for you if you would just goes in one ear, out the other. You have to take advantage of this, and you have to take what Navarr said, go research it for yourself, figure out how you are implementing internationalization in your project, see how that differs from what Navarr has recommended, and make this your own. That's what is absolutely critical with this conversation. You got to do that, and so um, make it your own, make it personal, change how you write applications, whether it's in Magento or anything else. Change how you write that, and you will greatly benefit from this conversation today. So, Zach has a comment. Let me just double check here. Oh, yeah. So it's just thanking you. Cool. All right. Well, excellent. So I'd say that brings this conversation to an end. Thank you all for joining, and it's been an absolute pleasure. And many thanks to Navarr for sharing his knowledge and building out this great presentation. It was definitely a time investment on his part. So thank you, Navarr.
thank you for having me.
All right. Take care, and we'll see you all next month at our next Ninja series. So take care.